All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar CalYouth, Proving Extended Foster Care Works for Young Adults in Transition from Foster Care. This webinar is brought to you by the Children's Bureau, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. We are joined by panelists Angie Schwartz, Deputy Director of the California Department of Social Services, and Courtney, CalYouth Researcher, Co-Director of the Transition Age Youth Research and Evaluation Hub at UC Berkeley School of Social Welfare. Our co-hosts today are Justin Hayden with the Child Welfare Information Gateway and Catherine Heath with the Children's Bureau, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. I will quickly go over a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available and posted after today's live event. This webinar will be interactive, featuring Q&A. Please use the Q&A feature to ask your questions, as chat is not currently enabled. And with that, I will turn it over to Catherine Heath.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're at in the country. As Bethany said, my name is Catherine Heath, and I use she and her pronouns, and I work at the Children's Bureau in Washington, D.C., where I do a lot of work on the older youth in transition portfolio, including the Champion Education Training Voucher Program, and one of my favorite areas, extended foster care under the federal option. So first of all, I just want to thank our presenters for making time today to really talk about a really relevant and pertinent conversation. I remember I came to the Children's Bureau back in 2009, just when this option was in discussion and people were talking about it. So it really is a privilege to be here in the same space with you today to really talk about this. We have 4 priority areas at the Children's Bureau: preventing children from coming into foster care, supporting kinship caregivers, investing in the child welfare workforce, and then also ensuring youth and young adults leave foster care with strengthened relationships, holistic supports, and opportunities. And extended foster care is part of that priority area, and really thinking through our opportunity to move forward together in order to serve our young people. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to provide a brief background about the federal option. So under Fostering Connections law, states now have the option to extend Title IV-E foster care, adoption, and guardianship assistance to age 21. And in many ways, what the law did is just basically take the word child and take it from the age of 18 to allow child welfare agencies to serve it up until the age of 21. This option became effective October 1st, 2010, and many states just basically switched over from offering a state-offered program to claim to the federal. But some states like California really look and took the time to think about designing a program that was really meeting the needs of transition age young people. If you want any more information about the options that are available and opting into extended foster care, please see our program instruction PI 1011 with the link on the screen. Next slide, please. So just to flag for folks that not only are you extending foster care for young people who are in foster care from the ages of 18 to 21, but if you do so, you also then have to cover young people who close out or their case is closed to kinship guardianship or an adoption assistance agreement if that happens at the ages of 16 and older. So again, there's some other populations that are covered under extended foster care, and I'm sure folks on the call will talk a little bit about how also those needs may be different, but also how little we actually know about how in some states extended assistance for those young people in adoption or kinship guardianship operate. So just wanted to make that note on the federal program. Next slide, please. So the other thing that's really interesting about the extended foster care program under the federal option is that in order to be eligible at the federal level, a young person has to also be meeting one of the following conditions. You have to be in school, you can be under a category around employment, or you could have a medical condition that would prevent you from participating in the educational and employment activities. We allow states to set what that looks like within the parameters of what's in the law. But as we all know, anybody who works with young people who are in transition, we know that young people are often across these categories. They're in school, they're working, they're in programs, they may be have a temporary medical condition. So we know that while this seems to be really clear in terms of category eligibility under the conditions, we know that it's much more fluid for young people and fluid for states working with young people. Next slide, please. So I guess you're maybe wondering what states besides California have opted into extended foster care. Please see the link on our website. This is where we keep up-to-date information on states that have opted into the federal option. And you may be thinking, oh, I'm in a state, but we offer extended foster care. These are the states that have opted into the federal program. Many states do have programs that look very similar to the federal option, but they're paid for by the state. So just wanted to flag that for you. And one additional note about extended foster care, the law does allow states after the age of 18 to allow young people to live in what's called a supervised independent living setting. So that is one place where in the law, there's additional flexibility, really recognizing where the needs of a young person in transition and extended foster care may look different from a placement option under the age of 18. The Children's Bureau has tried to provide as much flexibility as possible to encourage states to opt in and provide as expansive as programs as possible. And we are really excited to really understand this within the context of the other services that young people receive. Next slide, please. So another important opportunity that extended foster care added for us was the ability to then propose that we let states offer CHAFE services, again, at state option to an older age. So states that are providing extended foster care until the age of 21 can apply to ACF to receive approval to be able to use those CHAFE funds until the age of 23. CHAFE funds are the ones that are the funds that are most closely associated with the federal funding for young people in transition from foster care. Unfortunately, it doesn't mean any additional money, but it does allow additional flexibility. So with that, I'm going to turn over to my co-host, Justin Hayden, to introduce my co-host. And so with that, I'll turn it over to you, Justin.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Catherine. Hi, everyone. So once again, my name is Justin Hayden, and I am a consultant from CalYOUTH for Information Gateway. I'm very excited to be here with you all today and get to know more about the amazing work that is happening over at CalYOUTH. So for those who don't know, I'm originally from Indiana, and from being someone who once upon a time received extended foster care services and now works with young people who currently receive these services, I'm so glad to know that now that the system that our young people are coming into and receiving services is no longer the same system that I once entered into. Not to say that things are perfect now or that things are the absolute worst back then, but the uphill progress that has been affecting a lot of change in the right direction, in my opinion. So I think a great example of how agencies, well, I'll speak for Indiana specifically because that's what I know best, but how agencies have responded to their young people's needs during the pandemic. I know Catherine kind of covered a lot of like the standard services, eligibilities, and the benefits, but I kind of wanted to touch a little bit on like how we expanded upon services during the pandemic. For most of our young people during the time, a lot of them were in college, a lot of them were on college campuses with their dorms and things like that, and when things shut down, housing was one of the #1 priorities. So we had really went out and made sure that young people had access to housing, whether it be they were going off and getting their own apartments, or we were returning to foster homes where they had good relationships with, or we invited them to exercise the idea of going back into like intake care, things like that. Another one was when we understood that many of our young people were essential workers during that time and no longer had access to stable transportation or any transportation at all for that matter. And so we prioritized young people's right to transportation by meeting with gas cards and some help with car repairs and even car purchases. Another thing was mental health. A lot of our young people's physical health and physical needs were being met, but not a lot of their mental. And so we organized virtual information town halls, resources for virtual therapy services, and our youth advisory board actually had virtual regional meetings so that young people could still connect with their peers and all the work that we were doing at the time. And so that was just a little synopsis of the things that Indiana did to improve the extended foster care services at that time. But I think the reason I brought it up was because I think it served how we serve kids, young people during the pandemic set a great precedent. I think it showed that young people transitioning out of care have always needed these measures that we took to ensure their needs were being met during such a historical time in the world. However, I think instead of like reverting back to all the ways in which we were serving them originally, I think we continue to find other ways to continue to move the needle and how we serve them. And I'm aware that the concept of extended foster care is still young, like it's only 13 years old here in the US, and we're actually the only country that is doing it as far as I know. And so we're doing a lot of things by trial and error. But that being said, the work that is happening over at CalYouth with people like Courtney and Angie Schwartz is an amazing push towards a better child welfare system and extended foster care services across the country. And so with that being said, because I have talked long enough, I would like to kind of transition things over into introducing Angie Schwartz. And so Angie Schwartz has been the director of the Child and Family Services Division in California and Department of Social Services. Angie has led the work of the Children and Family Services Division, which is responsible for designing and overseeing an array of programs and services for California's at-risk children and families. She's focused on creating child and family well-being system to ensure that engagement with families in crisis and supports the parent and child, the values the child's family and community, and promotes all aspects of well-being so that children and families can heal and thrive while addressing disparities and inequalities within the system. And so Angie joined the California Department of Social Services nearly two decades ago, with experience in child welfare reform. Prior to joining, she served as Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at the Alliance of Children's Rights, where she spearheaded efforts to revamp California's rates and services to be fully inclusive of kinship families. Her advocacy results in a cultural shift across the California child welfare system is one that truly prioritizes kinship families. In addition, she was also instrumental in the success effort to extend foster care benefits to children of ages 21 in California to support our young people in attaining independence, and led efforts to ensure foster youth with disabilities are able to access Social Security benefits prior to exiting care as well. Earlier in her career, she also worked for the Public Interest Law Project and the National Center of Youth Law. And then lastly, Angie also earned her Bachelor's of Arts from the American University and her Juris Doctor degree from Stanford Law. And so now, that being said, everyone please join me in welcoming Angie Schwartz.
Thank you for that introduction. And I have been part of California's child welfare system for a long time in various roles, as Justin just said, including when we were working on extended foster care, although I was not the deputy director. At that time, I was one of the co-sponsors of extended foster care in California. The Alliance for Children's Rights was one of 9 organizations that co-sponsored the legislation and then worked closely on implementation. So it's actually been a long time since I've done an extended foster care presentation. So we'll see if it's all still relevant in terms of what we did to implement this law back in the day. So we were early adopters of extended foster care here in California. We introduced legislation immediately after the federal law passed, and it ended up being a 2-year bill. It took us 2 years to get that through the legislature. If you think back to what was going on back in that period of history, we were in a period of a lot of cuts in budgets. It was actually not great fiscal times. And so I think it's a testament to California and the fact that we did have 9 organizational co-sponsors come together and really work deeply on like, what is this law going to look like? And how can we really have it really take full advantage of everything that is being offered by this federal option? And those 9 organizational co-sponsors included the county welfare directors, meaning it included the counties and the leaders of counties who were saying, yes, we want this law for our young people. It included our provider association, the association that represents our foster family agencies, and at the time, group homes. We don't have group homes in California anymore. It included the California Youth Connection, so youth were at the table in how we developed this law, how we put it together. We had SEIU as one of the sponsoring organizations, which means we had the unions really pushing for this legislation. We had advocacy organizations like mine and the Youth Law Center and the John Burton Advocates for Youth. Also sort of pushing from our perspectives are also the Children's Law Center, which represents the dependency attorneys. So it was this broad coalition that included kind of all the different players within our foster care system. We also had the Judicial Council, which means we had the judges. So we had the judges, we had the lawyers, we had the advocates, we had the providers, we had the counties, and we all came together, not just to say we support this bill, but we came together as co-sponsors of the bill. And I've actually never seen a coalition like that on a bill before or since. We did this around extended foster care. It meant weekly meetings. It meant lots of debates around language and like how to do this and how to really, it was so helpful to have youth at the table because we really centered the experience of young people in all of that decision making. And when we would start to sort of go down a rabbit hole and be like, well, why don't we just do it this way? We would have young people say like, because that won't work for us. And I thought that that was really helpful as we were developing this law. So it took 2 years. And then we gave ourselves a whole other year to implement it. So even though the legislation passed in 2010, we did not implement until January 2012 because we knew we actually had a lot of policy to develop coming out of the statute. So California does a lot of things by statute. AB 12 is an extensive piece of legislation, and there were 4 or 5 cleanup bills following AB 12. There was AB 212 and AB 1712, and then a bunch of other ones that I don't remember. So there's been a lot of statute on this law, but there's also been a lot of policy guidance. And so we gave ourselves a year to sort of write that guidance and make sure that we could sort of get it out, do extensive trainings of the counties and the judges and the providers and make sure everyone was ready to go before January 1, 2012 when it implemented. So that's sort of the process that we went through in order to get the law on the books. It obviously extends foster care from 18 to 21 for all of our kids. And it all, as Catherine said, we also extended it for KinGAP and AAP kids because that was part of the federal law. We also have this thing in California called non-related legal guardians. And so those also received benefits up until the age of 21 as well. The process by which we did it was, it's an opt-out program. It's not an opt-in program. That was very intentional in California. We wanted every youth who turned 18 and had dependency jurisdiction on their 18th birthday to be in, and then they could exit if they wanted to, but they didn't have to. And doing it that way made sure that we didn't have young people falling through the cracks and sort of missing out on the experience of extended foster care. We also have the ability to exit and re-enter. It is an optional program for young people. They do have to sign a mutual agreement, but the way we did it in California was the mutual agreement was not a condition of eligibility. The eligibility was automatic by virtue of the fact that you turned 18 with a court order for foster care on your 18th birthday. The mutual agreement just said, like, I understand what I'm signing up for and that I'm agreeing to continue to do it, but it wasn't a reason that we would cut off funding. And I think that that was really important as well. And again, the youth voice is really critical in sort of designing some of these elements. Reentry in California is as many times as you want. You can exit, you can reenter, you can do it 5 times in 1 month. We've actually had it done in a single day when a young person has been exited for maybe not meeting those participation requirements that Catherine talked about. And we've had instances where the courts have exited a youth for not meeting a participation requirement, but they can just march down the hall and re-enter on the very same day. So we did that intentionally as well. So the participation conditions are very broad in California. We intentionally designed them as a way to make sure that there was a safety net for young people, and that category 3 that Catherine talked about, which is, you know, removing barriers to employment or education, is very broadly defined. So as long as you're doing anything that removes a barrier, the young people are considered to meet eligibility conditions, because we really relied on and worked closely with Dr. Courtney who's going to be doing the bulk of the speaking here, and really used his research in understanding sort of just the benefit of just those 3 more years in extended foster care. And we did not want to sort of have a punitive system. We wanted to have a system that was a true safety net for young people, and that's how we tried to design it. The reentry is also a very simple process. So it's just having to complete a voluntary reentry agreement. As soon as that's signed, the young person's back in and the funding turns back on. So they don't have to get to court. They don't have to wait for court. We recognize that some young people who needed to reenter were going to be in a state of crisis, meaning they're going to be homeless or in some other sort of perilous situation. So we wanted the funding to be able to turn on as of that same day. Obviously, there's no check that's provided that same day because funding is paid in arrears, but at least you know that that funding will be flowing, and it also makes the county responsible to provide support for that young person immediately upon reentry. We do have youth that are not eligible. So youth that join the military are not eligible for extended foster care if they're on active duty military status. If they're enlisted but not in the military, they are eligible. So it sort of depends on sort of what their status are. Incarcerated youth are not eligible, but as soon as they are released, they become eligible as long as they had that order for foster care on their 18th birthday. So if you get incarcerated after you turn 18 and you're in jail for a few months and then you get out, you can just re-enter and start participating in extended foster care. Again, youth that had guardianships ordered through our probate court are often not eligible, but non-related guardians through dependency court are eligible for extended foster care. We took advantage of the housing options that Catherine mentioned as well. So the federal law actually creates this category of supervised independent placements and sort of says like you can design supervised independent placements that are not sort of your traditional foster care placements. So we've actually designed more than 2. The law has changed since this slide was created. We actually have 3 at this point. So we have supervised independent living placements. We have transitional housing placement program for non-minor dependents. And we also have sort of a transitional category of placements to sort of allow youth to continue to receive funding as they're transitioning between placements. But the supervised independent living placement is the most independent. And I think that that's what Catherine had mentioned. So those are like your own apartment, your own house or roommate situation, renting a room from a relative. The transitional housing placement program is more of a model. Like there's 3 different kinds of transitional housing models that we have in California. We have a host family model, we have a scattered site, and we have single sites. We have different ways that community-based organizations offer a housing program where they're usually identifying the housing for the young person. They generally pay the rent and pay the landlord, and then they work with the young person to develop independent living skills. But it's an apartment that usually is a apartment that the youth has themselves or sometimes is shared with one other person, where they really are living independently, but with the support of that program underlying them so that they can sort of develop those transitional independent living skills. As I said, the SILP is the most independent. It's also our most highly utilized placement. So as I sit here and sort of reflect a decade after we've created the law on sort of where young people are, predominantly it's SILPs. And I think some of that is by design, but some of it is by sort of accident of policy, that it's just young people want to be in SILPs because the check goes directly to the young person. It's not very much money. It's about $1,200 a month. It doesn't cover the cost of rent in almost any city in California. And it's really not designed for youth that are not sort of having other income and other resources available to sort of make sure that they've got the ability to cover the full cost of living. And yet we do see many young people being put in SILPs without sort of that readiness to be in a SILP. So that's a policy issue that has come up in recent years that people continue to grapple with, because we do have sort of the majority of our young people that are in the extended foster care program are living in supervised independent living placements. We do have the ability for young people to just be in regular foster homes, the kinds of foster homes that existed before they turned 18. Also, there are some limitations on whether or not they can continue in STRTPs. That's not really where we want young people to be. I think I talked about reentry a little bit. One of the things that we did in subsequent legislation around reentry was allow young people who had been in a adoption or a guardianship situation, who had that individual, die or sort of not be able to be sort of responsible for them in that function anymore. Those youth can now reenter foster care and become part of our extended foster care program. So there's been some crossover to make sure that, if you exited foster care before you turned 18, but then that person that was supposed to be your permanent connection, something happens to sever that connection, we don't want those youth to be cut off. And so they do have the ability to re-enter and participate in extended foster care. And I think that was one of the innovations that we saw that needed to happen after we implemented the law. Then we have the extended benefits in KinGAP and AAP, but I'm not going to talk about these because I feel like I'm talking too long, and I feel like you probably mostly want to hear from Dr. Courtney and not hear from me. I'm happy to answer questions about all of the things we've done in California to try to make this law work. There is legislation on extended foster care every year. I can't think of a year that we haven't had legislation to continue to tinker with this program and try to improve it. So it's an ongoing, it's a work in progress, as all things child welfare are. But it is a law that I think most of us are enormously proud of, or a set of laws that a lot of us are enormously proud of in California. So I'll stop talking and stop sharing and turn it over to Mark.
Okay, hi everybody. Yes, I'm Mark Courtney. I'm an emeritus, that means retired professor at the University of Chicago. I mentioned that because that's where a lot of the work I'm going to talk about today happened. But I'm also the co-director now, and most of my work is housed at the University of California, Berkeley at the Transition Age Youth Research and Evaluation Hub in the Child Welfare Indicators Project. Some of you may be familiar with at UC Berkeley. It's great to be here. This has been a long road. I met Angie when the planning for AB 12 was going on, the development of legislation, and was really impressed, was able to do a study of the planning process that went on after that law passed, which I think California did a wise thing. If you're considering extended foster care, follow their lead on that, because it's a brave new world you're entering into, providing extended foster care. And it's also been a privilege to know Catherine since she joined the Children's Bureau. Both of them have been great thought partners for me, and they're great thought leaders on this topic. Let's see if I get this to go. Yep. So what I'm going to do today is describe the CalYouth study, California Youth Transitions to Adulthood study, because I think it's a great example of what states can do. If we can do it with California, you can do it where you are. As a way of understanding your implementation of extended foster care, how it's working, if it's working, through what means is it working, and if it's not working, why might that be the case? The study answers 3 questions. The most important one is was a state mandated evaluation of the program, and it wasn't funded by the legislature, which often happens. And so some funders made it possible to do this. Big question, does extended foster care impact, hopefully improve outcomes for young people? And then I'll also talk about the influence of county and influence of living arrangements, mainly looking at mechanisms for this. So this is the impact of our job is to evaluate AB 12. The impact factor was called AB 12 still by a lot of folks. And we got 3 questions. What impact extended foster care on youth well-being outcomes? What factors influence the support that young people receive? So what kind of support, what does extended foster care consist of really? And who gets it and who doesn't? And then in particular, how do living arrangements and other supports actually created by the federal law and then the state law, and Angie and Catherine have both been talking about that, impact these outcomes? This was made possible by a partnership between my research team at the University of Chicago and something called the California Child Welfare Co-Investment Partnership. And without that partnership, this study doesn't happen. I could talk for an hour about all kinds of things that would have put an absolute halt to the work had all of these partners not been involved in it. So CDSS, the state agency, County Welfare Directors Association, Judicial Council of California, and philanthropic funders, the Conrad Hilton Foundation, Walter S. Johnson Foundation, Stewart Foundation, RISA Foundation, Zellerbach Foundation, California Wellness, Annie E. Casey, and W.T. Grant were the core funders over some considerable period of time of this. So what did that allow us to do? I had those partners, we were able to do some things that otherwise we wouldn't be able to do. So we did interviews with young people making that transition to adulthood from foster care. They all had to be in care for about 6 months, and they were approaching, they're 17 on average age. And we interviewed 95% of the eligible population at baseline back in 2013, and we were able to follow over 4/5 of them at 19, 21, and 23. We did surveys of caseworkers because we want to understand the county context and their experience of working with these young people. The first survey was way back in 2013, and it was of workers who had somebody reach the age of 18 on their caseload at the time. We asked them about the characteristics of young people they serve, availability of services, collaboration with other systems, etc. 2015, we were actually able to do surveys of caseworkers who serve the young people who are still in care at age 19 in our survey. And that was between 400 and 500 young people and their caseworkers. And we get asked questions then about that particular young person that the caseworker served. Some of the caseworkers had many, some only had one. And again, we asked about county context. We also have government program administrative data, and this is really important. We were able to link data on anybody who turned 16 after turned 16 in care or were in care on their 16th birthday or entered care after that from 2006 all the way to 2019. Why is it important to go back to 2006? As Angie mentioned, the Great Recession happened. And if we're using administrative data and we want to look before and after the implementation of this policy, it was a luxury and a very important thing to be able to look not just at young people we talked to who are aging out in the context of this new policy, but young people who aged out years before. And because we could link the records of those people to outcomes in terms of employment and earnings, post-secondary education, use of public benefits, and we're in the process of getting data on other outcomes, we were really able to look at this policy and where it seemed to be working or not. We also use publicly available data on county context. I'll talk about why, but things like employment rates, housing costs, things like that can affect outcomes. And you don't get to choose what you're in. So it's important to look at that. So that's it. I'll talk about some things we found later, but if we have some time now, I'm available on Angie as well for questions.
Great. Well, first of all, I love having a co-host. So thank you, Justin, for bringing up the pandemic and the requirement under the Supporting Youth and Families Through the Pandemic Act that required child welfare agencies to keep young people in foster care and not have them exit out because of their age and or not meeting the conditions. So really, just wanted to highlight that even if you haven't, if you're not in a state that has formally extended federal foster care, all states now have experience with having young people remain in foster care after the age of 18 and re-enter foster care. So Justin, thanks for bringing that up because that's a really important point. Just a quick question for Deputy Director Schwartz. You mentioned that the direct payment for a young person who's in a supervised independent living payment is $1,200, but the audience would like to know more about what are the costs associated with being in a THP foster care placement or THP plus. So I don't know if you're able to answer that, but that was one of the questions that came in.
I don't know the THP NMD payment amount off the top of my head, but I can probably look it up really fast. I think it's in the range of $2,800, $2,900 a month. Not all of that money goes directly to the young person. It goes to the provider. It goes to the transitional housing provider. And then different transitional housing providers have different kind of program models, all of which have to be approved, as a condition of their license as a transitional housing program, but they sort of have different approaches and they're allowed to have different approaches to how much of those dollars are actually passed on to the young person. And so some of them, the majority of the dollars are passed on, but then the young person has to pay for their own rent and they have to sort of pay all of their utilities and their bills and things like that. That's not the norm. Most of them pass on a small stipend to the young person every month, and there's budgeting classes and things that the young person learns how to sort of manage that money, but the rent and the utilities and things are paid for by the transitional housing provider. That is more commonly what happens. But I can look up what the exact dollar amount is. It'll just take me a second to find it.
Great. And we do have a short Q&A pause here, but we're going to turn it back over to Mark Courtney after Justin asks another question. But please do have your questions keep coming in the chat. We do have time at the end to be able to answer them. And I just wanted to acknowledge the people who are talking about the cost of housing, the challenges in being able to secure safe and affordable housing, even with extended foster care, and the inflation of education and any number of things. So I just wanted to recognize that because a couple of questions have come in. We're going to circle back to them at the end. But with that, I'll turn it over to you, Justin, to ask that question about the military.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to give Angie some time to find that number, but earlier you had spoke on.
I almost have it.
We want to do 4 things at once during our webinar.
Yeah.
Well,
earlier,
I should say we've done, I actually found it. So
awesome.
I forgot that we have supplements by counties now. So there's different rates depending on the county that the young person lives in. So some counties that have higher costs receive a housing supplement. And so then and it's more than I thought. So the host family rate is $3,335. The remote site and the single site rate are $4,192, but then some counties receive supplements, and the highest supplements look like they're in the range of $700 additional dollars. They vary anywhere from $27 up to $695 in supplements. So it's a little bit complicated how we do the funding for transitional housing. And it sort of depends on this calculation of fair market rent in that region. And I should say there was also a piece of legislation that passed this last year that's going to provide a similar supplement to SILP payments based on fair market rent. So youth that are in SILPs that are in high cost counties will also, in a couple of years, be getting those additional payments as well. That has to be automated before it's implemented. So it takes a little while for us to work through automation. So that's not how it works right now. For the youth in SILPs, that is limited to the $1,200 right now, but in a couple of years, there'll be additional funding flowing to kids in counties with higher fair market rents. So anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Justin, but
oh no, perfectly
always
fine.
good to look things up.
Yeah, I definitely have no problem waiting. That was great information. Thank you. But going back to some of the things you spoke on earlier, you had mentioned that young people who are actively serving in the military are ineligible for services. If you could you explain the thought process around that?
I think because most of their expenses are covered, and so that was the policy that was put in place. As I said, if they're not on active duty status, they're in reserves or something like that, they can participate in extended foster care, but when they're on active duty, they're ineligible.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. Catherine, will I pass that back over to you?
Well, let's pass back over to Mark because I know he has a lot more information to cover and will answer a lot of the questions that are in the chat. So Dr. Mark, we'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, thanks. I hope so. I want to start by saying this is really a teaser of what we know from CalYouth and even post CalYouth through the Hub at this point, because we've been synthesizing findings across all the different studies of CalYouth in areas like parenting, counties, effect, things like that. And so if you're interested, if you type CalYouth in any browser, it'll take you to Shape and Hall website. Everything that ever published that's not beyond the paywall is there. And if you type in Hub, you get a bunch of additional stuff, and anything coming out in the future will come out through the Hub. So, to the punchline here, does extended foster care have legs? CalYouth has shown, and actually the earlier Midwest study had shown that extending foster care to 21 definitely has benefits while young people remain in care up to the age of 21. But I often get confronted with the question, well, they're all going to become homeless after 21 anyway, or they're all going to go to jail. And so the question is, are there really lasting benefits of extended care? And so we asked that question. And we looked at about 24 outcomes in kind of all the major developmental domains any responsible parent, including the government parent, would be interested in. And here's what we found. And I'm going to go very quickly through this. The really punchline is, how much benefit or not does each additional year in extended foster care after the age of 18 affect outcomes at age 23. So this is 2 years after everybody's left care, right? So I'm just going to point out a couple of these in one or two in each domain here. So in terms of education, it increased the probability of ever enrolling in college by 10 to 12 percentage points. That's stunning. That's like over 1/5 the percentage of young people that go to college. In terms of employment, it increased their expected probability of working in the past year. So again, that's after the age of 21. This would be between 22 and 23, at least 20 hours a week by 5 percentage points. What about hardships, homelessness, social support? So it reduced food insecurity, the USDA measure of food insecurity in the past year, again, between 22 and 23 by 1/5. In terms of homelessness, it decreased the odds of being homeless or couch surfing since the last interview. And in almost all cases, that was since age 21 by about 1/5. And in terms of social support, this is a very important one. Social connections, I know we really want to have an impact on that, not just things like employment, earnings, et cetera. It increased the likelihood that youth said that they have adequate social support by about 1/4. So the real takeaway of that is, I would just summarize our findings thus far in CalYouth, is we found benefits of extended foster care at ages 19, 21, and 23 across a vast array of outcomes. In some cases, we don't find impacts. So for example, we have yet to find an impact on mental health. That's something we need to work on. But we've also not found any negative effects of extended foster care. We haven't found any harm associated with it. So the other two things I said I would talk about is what are the mechanisms of this? What's in the gut of make a difference? Now, in California, as you know, nationally, the child welfare system varies across jurisdictions. Some states have centralized state-supervised systems, others have county-administered systems. And that type of administration affects a lot of things: the centralization of authority, fiscal responsibility, the implementation of policies, licensing, and workforce development. And in California, for those of you who don't know, California is a state-supervised, county-administered system. So the state sets policy, finance, et cetera, but the 58 counties actually provide services. I've had the pleasure of working with tutors, Angie and Greg Rose, and Rose used to say, it's the county's kids. They're the ones that actually are the ones that directly serve the young people. So what we've done at the TAY Hub, and you can look up this Counties Matters report on our website, is we try to go across all these studies that we've done in CalYouth where county, some aspect of county context was measured, and look at what the effects of those county contexts can be. And you can see county can affect things like socioeconomic context, collaboration across systems, court systems, and availability of services generally. And basically, we have almost no research on this. We don't have very little research on this in the child welfare system generally, but really none on young adults except the work that we've done. So we are already talking about our general methods. We did these interviews with young people, and they talk about services they received, et cetera, and we can nest those responses within the county they live in. We also did these caseworker surveys that looked at availability of services, coordination, the attitudes of workers toward extended care, their perception of the attitudes of their supervisors about extended care, and their perceptions of folks like the courts. So many people say, well, I'm a big fan of extended foster care. The judge in my county, not so much. And then collaboration was a very important one. And then we also looked at specialization of workers. We asked the workers, who do you serve? And we looked at specialization a couple of different ways, but primarily we have workers that only serve transition age youth. And we have a lot of workers, most workers in the state that are supervising these young people actually have mixed caseloads. Most of the people on their caseload are little kids. So they might have one young adult on their caseload. And we have lots of studies in CalYouth where we looked at this. And so, what have we found? And I'm going to summarize those findings broadly, but to report those in a more detail. We find that caseworkers' perceptions of service availability and cross-system collaboration, collaboration with employment systems, education systems, mental health, etc., were associated with independent living services. Which ones that youth felt were helpful, but also a range of outcomes, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Caseworkers generally perceive the need for services and support beyond 18. So that's an important finding. The vast majority of these workers were very supportive of extended care. We asked them a simple question: when do you think young people will be ready on their own? Overwhelming majority said after the age of 21. But some expressed concerns that extended foster care would create dependence on the government. They were a minority, but it's there. So it's something we have to take into account. One of the things we found is very important when we looked at this in great detail is actually the length of extended foster care stays, and basic take-up of extended foster care varies widely between counties in California by months, between the county with the highest participation rate and lowest participation rate. And that was affected by things like the caseworkers' satisfaction with interagency collaboration, but particularly with folks in the courts. It made a big difference that the courts and the child welfare system were on the same page with respect to extended foster care. We found, as I mentioned earlier, youth satisfaction with dependent living transition planning also differed between counties quite a bit, with higher unemployment rates and perceived service availability associated with greater youth participation. That's kind of not surprising. If you got a high unemployment rate, you might really want that help, as opposed to I don't need them. And then also service availability. And young people said, when the workers said that services were more available, young people tended to stay longer. And then county context, urbanicity was a big one, how urban the county was. That we could talk about why. Cost of living and collaboration affected a variety of outcomes. So housing options, whether young people had access to THP, these transitional housing programs, for example, education outcomes, mental health utilization, and employment and earnings. So the last thing I want to talk about, counties matter, but the last thing I want to talk about is we have this new placement situation, right? And Angie and Catherine talked about that a lot. California has expanded this use, or is using this new placement option of supervised independent living placements creatively. And they now have three. I'm going to tell the two that I'm going to talk about are the supervised independent living placement, essentially a subsidy. At minimum, it consists of is a subsidy. I think it's around $1,000 a month now, and at least once a month visit with your caseworker. Our data suggests it's pretty much once a month visit. There's not a lot more than that. There's not less than that, really. We don't know much about these placement arrangements, but we've been offering them in California and a number of states for a while now. So one of the things that we found is very important, over this time period, say 2012, 2018, I'm sharing this because there's some studies we've used with these data. One of the things we need to recognize is things like SILPs and THP, the transitional housing programs, that they weren't available early, or they weren't used very much early in the program, because in the case of SILPs, there really weren't the procedures in place and the norms of workers knowing how to navigate this with young people to let them live in the community, because you have to make sure it's a safe place for them, et cetera. So if you look about 2012, the first year of this program, almost all the young people spent most of their time in other placements. Those other placements are non-relative foster home, relative foster home, overwhelmingly, sometimes group care. And you see relatively low use of SILPs and THP. But by 2015 and after that, at any point in time, over 2/5 of young people are living in a community in a SILP in their own place, some kind of their own place. And around 1/5, it's up to actually over 1/4 in recent years, would be leaving transitional housing placements, and only 30% are living in these other placements. And that's generally younger people, 18-year-olds, some 19-year-olds staying with their foster parents. So that's really important. So we wanted to look at our extended foster care placement types associated with employment and educational outcomes. That's important to know. We're investing a lot of money, particularly in transitional housing. So one thing we did right off the bat is, do the characteristics of young people in these different settings differ? And the answer is yes. Young people going to transitional housing programs in general have backgrounds and current, functioning characteristics that are indicative of young people who are going to need more help. So they have placement instability, history of group care placement, they have kids, disabilities, mental health problems. Basically, young people, the more you had of those, the more likely you were going to be living the transitional housing placement. That's good. That's consistent with policy in California. The state does not want to be using a $3,000 a month or so placement when that's not what a young person really needs. So what do we find? I'll simplify it here. We found that THP placements, these transitional housing placements, were associated, after controlling for these child characteristics, with higher odds of employment in comparison to these other placements, SILP and other, and also higher estimated odds of enrollment in post-secondary education. So that's good news. So I guess the takeaway here is, while this THP serves young people with higher average needs, it's still associated with higher rates of youth employment and enrollment in post-secondary education. So what about the providers of these agencies? Say, oh, well, there's transitional housing programs. How are they operated? Well, they're all operated. Well, almost all of them are operated by contract not-for-profit agencies. Some counties actually operate their own transitional housing program, but that's pretty rare in California. And this slide shows over these two time periods. The time periods aren't that important. It has to do with what we have outcomes on. We had some administrative data outcomes for the earlier period, not for the later period. But let's look at the right there, 2016, 2018. You see there's 5,000 young people who stayed in transitional housing programs over that period of time. And there were 68 licensed providers of this in the state. But that's a bit misleading. If you look at how many of them served even 1% of the young people in care, it's only 24. And if you look even further, the largest 10 providers in the state accounted for almost 2/3 of the days spent in transitional housing in California. So that's very important. Those 10 providers are serving most of the young people who get served. And some of them serve multiple counties. Others really only serve one county. So how we think about access to transitional housing in the state of California has to focus a lot on these providers, where they're accessible, who they're willing to serve in terms of counties, et cetera. So did the outcomes differ? We decided to take this administrative data with all the data we had in the backgrounds of these young people, and then look at who served them. We basically came up with what we might call a performance indicator for these providers across a couple of outcomes, 3 outcomes actually: employment, education, and undesirable discharge. That rate of young people being, kicked out of care theoretically, but leaving a transitional housing placement in ways that we worry about was about 30% when we were doing this study. So we wanted to see, is there variation providers? And the simple answer to that question is yes. I'm just going to share this slide to show that. So this basically shows the percent of young people who were in a transitional housing program who ever enrolled in college during the time they were in that program. And if we took these providers and we go from 0 to, the lowest level of performance, that's 16, 18%. And the highest level, I can't actually see in my slide, but it's much higher than that. But let's look at the middle there, what's called the interquartile range. So if you think of the provider at the 25th percentile, about 32% of young people in that served by that provider enrolled in college, where it was 43% in the one at the 75th percentile. That's a big variation. And we have similar variation for the other outcomes we looked at, actually. So I guess I'll summarize the answer to the question: do average outcomes of youth living in transitional housing differ between provider agencies? And the answer is yes, in a big way, actually. The outcomes of youth depend on which provider they stayed with. Youth characteristics explain some of this. some of the providers are actually dealing with young people who have characteristics that are associated with better outcomes and some others with not so good outcomes. And that matters in terms of who they're serving. But it also mattered what counties they were serving. Because again, homelessness tends to be higher in counties with really expensive housing. I'm living, you can see I'm in my cabin. In the county I live in, if you have $900 a month, you can find a place to rent and you can meet your basic needs. That won't even cover housing in most of the urban areas in California. So that matters as well. And there's a mix of those counties. So what we've done is we generated these outcomes and we shared this information with CDSS, and CDSS shared it with the providers. So we're on a path in California to try to understand how providers in the state and the counties, because the counties make referrals to these very important resources, are informing outcomes. So again, you type TAHUB in any web browser, and my co-director, Andy Lane Eastman at USC, or I will, if you send us email, we're happy to point you in the right direction, but that is where CalYouth is housed now.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. I guess one question I think would be really helpful for us to answer is what's next with the CalYouth research study? What other information do we expect to come from it? I just love the fact that you guys are talking about, again, providing this information and data back to the providers and the counties and using it in real time. So what's next? And I'll open it up to Dr. Mark and Angie, also Deputy Director Angie, to kind of talk about what you see as the possibility for what's next with the data.
Sure, I'll try to be brief. So CalYouth is now, we talk about the TAHUB now, and we're carrying on the work of CalYouth, but we're generating other data already through the TAHUB, and that's the purpose of the TAHUB in a lot of ways, is to continue this work and build on it. And we're building on it by engaging, just the way CalYouth did, with the various parties of interest in California. We had a big convening with the counties, the state, the courts, providers, etc., when we launched the TAHUB, to identify research questions that the field considers important. That is our research agenda, those research questions. And we're adding other administrative data outcomes, things like involvement in the justice system, parenting, etc., to the administrative data we have. And we funded actually a number of small grants to provide other researchers to do research that we really aren't in a position to do, mostly qualitative research, but some of it with big numbers, focusing on the questions that have been identified by our partners. So that's really where it's at. If you're interested in CalYouth, go to the TAHUB site. And I can let Angie chime in on the state's perspective on this.
I don't have anything to add. I mean, that's the research that's continuing, and we're grateful to Mark and his team for all of the research that's being done. We use it to inform policy and to continue to help to fine-tune our laws.
Well, one thing that came up in the chat, we're not going to have time to be able to answer everybody's questions, is I love the thinking about opting out versus opting in. Like, you opt in if you're in foster care at the age of 18 and older. But for those young people who are opting out, what do we know about them in terms of the research and other information that's out there around, again, those who are opting in, utilizing services, and those who may not be high utilizers of services or not opting out of the extended foster care?
I'll say that Dr. Courtney probably knows the data better than I do. We have high uptake, high utilization of extended foster care in California. So we are not, and I believe that that is especially true of kids at 18 and 19 years old, that we're not seeing kids opting out in large numbers. They are taking advantage of the program, and we're continuing to try to improve upon the actual program pieces of it so that it's more than just housing and housing assistance for the young people, and really connect it more to their transition services. But I'm not seeing, like, I guess I wouldn't know, maybe Dr. Courtney knows sort of what similarities the group of kids that are opting out may have, but it's not a high number. Like, I know that we have largely broad participation in extended foster care.
That's right. Well, we started with young people at 17. Sometimes we go back to 16. If you're in care at 17 and a half, you got about 80% likelihood of being in care at 19, and almost 60% are going to be in care on the 21st birthday. So some drop out, right around the transition to adulthood. And there's not a big difference. It's not like the ones that don't stay or, not functioning as well or better. There's sort of subtle differences. Another thing I would say is extended foster care has definitely increased the likelihood that young people who are in care at 17 will still be there at 18. And it is not because of a reduction in legal permanency. We don't see significant evidence of that. What we do see is a reduction in other exits between 17 and 18. And those other exits tended to be running away from care and not coming back, or ending up in the juvenile justice system. We see a big decrease in both of those. So if I'm thinking from before to after, I would say that there are young people who in the past who had more problems, who left care even before their 18th birthday, tend to be sticking around now. And as Angie said, if you're in care on your 18th birthday, you're way likely to still be in care on your 21st birthday. And because folks can leave and come back, we saw in our youth survey about 14% left after 18, but then they came back, right? So they can't opt back in. We find the rate of homelessness higher among those who opted out and came back in during the period of time where they decided they didn't want to be in. So I think it's a good story generally.
Awesome. Thank you so much for both of you for clarifying some of those questions that we had. I know we're getting close to time, so I want to start wrapping up. And by doing that first, I want to say big thank you to Mark and Angie for being here today with us and sharing all the amazing things you all have going on in California. I also want to say thank you to my co-host, Catherine Heath, for being an amazing support, an amazing co-facilitator. I also want to thank our tech support and our other co-facilitators, Bethany Embody and Stephanie Parento, for your work here. And then lastly, I want to thank our audience all for your participation and your engagement. And so I really do hope you were able to learn with us in this space and take whatever information you have back with you to yours. And lastly, just have a good day, everyone. Take care. Also, we will be sharing out the slides as well. So be on the lookout for that as well. I almost forgot.